White teens buried an elderly black woman alive. But what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and share this video. Let the truth be heard. Where are you watching this from? Write it in the comments. The evening air was cool and damp as Ruth Walker tightened her shawl around her shoulders. The narrow dirt road that snaked through the edge of the abandoned cornfield was dark, save for the faint silvery light of the moon peeking through scattered clouds. Her footsteps crunched against the gravel, steady and rhythmic, while her thoughts wandered to the day's events. The church had been particularly lively that afternoon. The congregation was preparing for the upcoming Thanksgiving service, and Ruth, as usual, had volunteered to help clean and organize. Though her back ached and her knees protested with every bend, she had stayed late scrubbing pews and folding linens. Her hands were rough from years of such work, yet she found peace in these small acts of service. In her other hand, she carried a brown paper bag filled with food. It was for Mr. Carter, her elderly neighbor who had been bedridden for weeks with a fever. The man didn't have any family nearby, and Ruth often checked on him, bringing him meals and keeping his spirits up. It wasn't much, but she believed in doing what she could for those around her as she walked. The whispers of the dry corn stalks flanking the road filled the silence. The field had been abandoned for years, left to grow wild after the farmer moved away. The dead plants loomed like shadowy sentinels under the pale moonlight. Ruth had always found this path unsettling at night, but it was the quickest route home. She muttered a quiet prayer under her breath, asking for safe passage as she had done countless times before her mind drifted to the town she called home. It was a small southern place where everyone knew everyone. Some faces greeted her warmly, others turned away, cold and indifferent. Being one of the few black residents in the area had never been easy, even after decades of living there. Prejudice was an old stubborn weed that thrived in the soil of this town. Ruth had learned to navigate it with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness take root in her heart. A sudden flash of light broke her reverie. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger. As a vehicle approached from behind, Ruth instinctively moved closer to the edge of the road, her heart quickening. The truck slowed as it neared her, the rumble of its engine unsettling in the quiet night. She cast a quick glance over her shoulder, hoping the driver would pass by without incident. Instead, the truck pulled up alongside her and came to a stop. 5 figures sat in the open bed of the pickup, silhouetted against the headlights. Their laughter was loud and coarse through the stillness of the night. Ruth's chest tightened as she recognized a few of the faces. They were local boys, teenagers from town. She had seen them before at the gas station, loitering outside the convenience store, always loud and brash. Well, what do we have here?" One of them drawled. His voice was dripping with mockery. Ruth didn't need to see his face to know it was Jack Thompson. He was the leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered boy with a permanent sneer. His father owned the biggest hardware store in town, and his family was well-connected, which gave Jake a sense of invincibility. Ruth didn't stop walking. She kept her head high, her steps measured. "Good evening," she said firmly, hoping to diffuse whatever this was. Jake jumped down from the truck bed and landed on the road with a heavy thud. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone mocking. "Out for a little stroll, are we?" The other boys laughed, their voices echoing across the field. One of them, a skinny, nervous-looking boy named Trevor, didn't join in. He hung back, his gaze darting between Jake and Ruth. "I'm on my way home," Ruth said evenly, not breaking her stride. "I'd appreciate it if you let me pass." Jake smirked and stepped into her path. "What's the rush? It's a nice night. Maybe we can have ourselves a little chat." Ruth stopped. Her eyes met Jake's calm but unyielding. "I don't want any trouble," Jake repeated, feigning innocence. He turned to his friends. "Did you hear that? She thinks we're trouble." The boys erupted in laughter again, but it was hollow. Ruth could sense the tension beneath their bravado. Jake was putting on a show, but for whose benefit? "Let her go, Jake," Trevor said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The laughter died instantly. All eyes turned to him, and he shrank back under the weight of their scrutiny. Jake's smirk twisted into a scowl. "What's the matter? Trev, are you going soft on us?" Trevor looked at Ruth, then at Jake, before lowering his eyes. It's late. We should go." Jake stepped closer to Ruth, his shadow swallowing hers in the moonlight. Ruth's stomach churned, but she refused to let fear show on her face. "You don't want to do this," she said softly. Jake straightened and motioned to the others to grab her. Before Ruth could react, two of the boys were on her, their hands rough as they pulled her toward the edge of the road. Her bag of food fell to the ground, its contents spilling onto the gravel. She struggled, but they were too strong. "No!" she cried out, her voice echoing into the night. "Let me go!" Jake laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're going to regret talking back, old lady." The last thing Ruth saw before she was dragged into the shadows of the cornfield was Trevor's pale, conflicted face. Frozen in hesitation, the air grew colder as they dragged Ruth into the cornfield, her heels scraping against the uneven ground, the dry stalks rustling ominously around her, their skeletal forms casting jagged shadows under the dim moonlight. Ruth struggled against the boy's grip, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, snagging on a stalk, and was left behind like a discarded memory. Jake led the group deeper into the field, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. His boots crunched against the soil with a confidence that made Ruth's skin crawl. Behind him, the other boys moved in nervous silence, their earlier bravado beginning to waver. "Where are you taking me?" Ruth demanded, her voice steady. Despite the fear rising in her chest, she didn't expect an answer, but she wouldn't let them see her terror. Not yet. Jake stopped and turned. His grin was cruel and sharp. "We're just having a little fun. Don't you worry, ma'am. You'll be just fine. If you can handle a little dirt." The others laughed uneasily, their eyes flickering between Jake and Ruth. It was clear that not all of them shared his enthusiasm. Trevor lingered at the edge of the group, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself invisible. Jake gestured toward a shallow pit in the ground, no more than a few feet wide and just as deep. It had been dug weeks ago by local kids messing around but forgotten when their interest waned. Now it was Jake's stage, and Ruth was the unwilling star of his twisted show. "Put her in," Jake ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. Two of the boys hesitated, glancing at each other. "Jake, come on," one of them muttered. It was Chris, a lanky boy with a perpetual slouch. "This is messed up." Jake turned on him, his eyes narrowing. "What's the problem?" "Chris, are you scared of a little dirt too?" Chris hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it's just maybe we should let her go. She's not going to tell anyone." Jake stepped closer to Chris, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows between them. "You getting soft on me? You want to be next." The threat hung heavy in the air, silencing any further objections. Chris looked away, his face pale, and stepped back into the group. Jake smirked triumphantly and turned to the others. Reluctantly, the boys obeyed. They pushed Ruth towards the pit, forcing her to her knees. She fought to keep her balance. Her hands clutched on the loose soil. Her voice rose in defiance, echoing through the field. "You think this makes you a man?" she shouted, her eyes blazing. "Hurting an old woman? You're nothing but cowards." Jake laughed, his voice cold and hollow. "Big words for someone in your position. Maybe a little dirt will teach you some respect." The boy shoved her into the pit. The earth was cold and damp against her hands as she landed hard on her side. She winced, biting back a cry of pain before she could scramble to her feet. They were on her, shoveling loose dirt into the pit. The soil fell in heavy clumps, clinging to her clothes and filling the air with a suffocating dust. Trevor stood, frozen at the edge of the scene, his hands trembling. He watched as the others worked, their faces pale and strained in the flashlight's glare. His stomach churned, and his chest tightened with guilt. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop this, but his feet refused to move. Jake barked orders, his voice cutting through the night. "Hurry up, we don't have all night." The pit filled quickly with dirt, rose around Ruth, encasing her legs, then her waist. She struck, struggling, but the weight of the soil pinned her in place. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, the scent of earth clogging her nostrils. Jake crouched at the edge of the pit, his grin widening as he looked down at her. "How's that for a lesson, huh? Maybe next time you'll think twice before acting like you're better than us." Ruth glared up at him. Her expression was defiant despite the tears streaming down her face. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice shaken but firm. "You're just a scared little boy hiding behind his friends." Jake's grin faltered for a moment. His jaw tightening, he grabbed a handful of dirt and tossed it in her face. "You talk too much," he snapped. Trevor took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Jake, that's enough." Jake whirled around, his flashlight beam catching Trevor's pale, stricken face. "What did you say?" Trevor swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I said that's enough. Let him go." Jake stared at him for a long moment, the tension crackling between them. Then he laughed, a harsh biting sound that made Trevor flinch. "You hear that, boys? Little Trevor thinks he's in charge now." The other boys shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between Jake and Trevor. "Chris, let's go." He turned and stalked back toward the truck, his flashlight swinging wildly in the darkness. The others followed, their footsteps dragging as if weighed down by unseen chains. Trevor lingered for a moment, his eyes locked on Ruth. Her face was calm now, her eyes steady and unyielding. "Go," she said softly, "before he turns on you too." Trevor hesitated, his heart pounding, then turned and ran after the others. The sound of their laughter faded into the distance, leaving Ruth alone in the silent, empty field. The moonlight spilled into the pit. Illuminating her tear-streaked face, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. And then she waited. The truck roared down the deserted country road, its tires kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the crisp night air inside the cab. Jake sat in the driver's seat, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The others were silent, the earlier laughter and bravado extinguished. Trevor sat wedged between Chris and another boy named Danny, his hands clenched into fists on his lap, the weight of what they'd done pressed down on him like a stone. Jake turned up the radio, the static crackling, before settling on an old rock station. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, trying to fill the oppressive silence. "Well, that was fun," he said, his tone light but with an edge of forced confidence. "You boys are going to remember this night for a long time." No one responded. Chris shifted uncomfortably, staring out the window at the passing shadows of trees. Danny scratched at his arm, avoiding eye contact. Trevor could feel the tension between them thick and suffocating. "You've gone too far this time, Jake," Chris muttered. Finally, his voice was low but firm. Jake slammed his hand against the steering wheel, making everyone jump. "Too far? What the hell does that even mean? She's fine. It's not like we killed her." Trevor's stomach churned at the word killed. His mind replayed the image of Ruth buried up to her neck in the cold, dark earth, her eyes wide with fear and defiance. He could still hear her voice, calm and steady, as she faced down Jake's cruelty. She didn't deserve any of this, none of it. "She's an old woman," Jake Chris said, his voice rising. "You don't think she could freeze out there, or she's fine?" Jake snapped, cutting him off. "She'll get out. Someone will find her. It's not our problem." Trevor couldn't take it anymore. The guilt that had been building inside him corrupted him. "What if no one finds her?" he said, his voice trembling. "What if she doesn't get out?" Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting Trevor's reflection. His jaw clenched, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "If you're so worried, why don't you go back and dig her out?" Trevor's throat tightened. He wanted to scream to demand that they turn around and undo the damage they'd done. But fear paralyzed him. Jake's authority over the group was absolute, and challenging him felt like stepping into quicksand. "Thought so," Jake said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't have the guts." The truck pulled into a clearing near the edge of town where the boys usually hung out. Jake killed the engine and leaned back in his seat, looking at each of them in turn. "Here's the deal. Nobody says a word about tonight, got it? Not to your parents, not to your little girlfriends. Nobody." Chris opened his mouth to protest, but Jake cut him off with a glare. If anyone talks, we're all going down. And I promise you, if I go down, I'm taking every single one of you with me." The threat hung in the air like a noose. Trevor's heart pounded as he nodded along with the others. His stomach twisted at the thought of keeping this secret. He knew it was wrong, but he didn't know how to fix it. Not yet. Jake lit a cigarette and blew out a stream of smoke. "Good. Now go home. We'll act like nothing happened." The boys climbed out of the truck one by one, their movements slow and hesitant. Trevor lingered, his mind racing. He wanted to say something to convince the others that they couldn't leave Ruth out there. But his voice caught in his throat. Jake glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. "You got something to say, Trev?" Trevor shook his head quickly and slid out of the truck. The cool night air hit him like a slap, and he shoved his hands into his jacket pockets to stop them from shaking as the others scattered toward their respective homes. Trevor stood on the edge of the clearing, staring back at the dark silhouette of the cornfield in the distance. His chest felt tight, and his thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. He couldn't stop seeing Ruth's face, her piercing eyes that seemed to look right through him. He couldn't go home. Not like this. Trevor waited until Jake's truck disappeared down the road, then turned and started walking back toward the field. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he couldn't stop. He didn't know what he would do when he got there, but he couldn't just leave her. The cornfield was eerily quiet when Trevor arrived. The rustling of the stalks sounded like whispers carrying secrets he didn't want to hear. He turned on the flashlight on his phone, the weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. "Mrs. Walker," he called softly, his voice trembling. "Are you still here?" There was no answer. Panic clawed at his chest as he stumbled toward the spot where they had left her. The pit was empty, the soil disturbed, but no longer filled. Trevor's breath hitched. Had she managed to escape? Had someone found her? Or was it already too late? "Mrs. Walker!" he called again. Louder this time, still nothing. Trevor sank to his knees, his flashlight falling to the ground. His heart pounded in his ears as he stared at the empty pit. The weight of what they'd done crashed over him, leaving him gasping for air. He stayed there for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into his bones. Finally, he forced himself to stand and stumbled out of the field, his mind blank with guilt and fear. As he reached the road, the faint sound of a tractor's engine reached his ears. Trevor turned, squinting into the distance, and saw a pair of headlights approaching slowly. The figure of a man appeared silhouetted against the glare. Relief and dread wedged in Trevor's chest. "Please," he whispered to himself. "Please let her be okay." The rumble of the tractor echoed faintly in the night air as Ruth shivered in the cold pit. Her hands were trembling, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or the biting chill of the damp earth pressing against her body. She tried to shift, but the weight of the dirt around her made it nearly impossible. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she looked up at the vast, uncaring sky. The sound of the tractor grew louder, closer. At first she thought she was imagining it, a desperate hope conjured by her fading strength. But as the light of the vehicle's headlamps flickered through the towering corn stalks, her pulse quickened. Someone was coming. She tilted her head back and shouted as loudly as she could, her voice hoarse and cracking, "Help over here, please!" Her cries broke. The stillness of the field was carried by the cold wind, and she didn't know if they were loud enough to be heard. But it was all she had left. Her throat burned, and her voice grew weaker with each call. The tractor's engine cut off. Ruth strained her ears, holding her breath. Then came the sound of boots crunching on the dirt, deliberate and cautious. "Hello," a deep, gruff voice called out. It was a man's voice, weathered with age and experience. "Who's there?" Ruth's heart leapt. "I'm here in the pit. Please help me." The footsteps grew faster, closer. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the field until it landed on her face. The man sucked in a sharp breath, and she could see his silhouette pause for a moment, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Good Lord," he muttered. Hurrying to the edge of the pit, he crouched down, shining the light directly on her. "What the hell happened here? Who did this to you?" Ruth blinked against the harsh glare, her voice barely above a whisper. "A group of boys. Teenagers. They dragged me out here and buried me." The man set the flashlight on the ground. Its beam pointed upward to illuminate the scene. He was older, with a broad frame and a face lined by years of hard work. Under the sun, his hands were calloused as he began digging at the dirt around her with surprising gentleness. "Don't you worry," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'll get you out of here." Ruth let her head fall back against the dirt wall, exhaustion washing over her. "Thank you," she murmured, her strength fading. The man worked quickly, using his hands to scoop the dirt away from her shoulders and arms. Once she was free enough to move, he helped her climb out of the pit. She stumbled as she stood, her legs trembling from the strain, and he caught her, holding her steady. "You all right?" he asked, concern etched into his features. Ruth nodded weakly. "I think so." Just shaking, he led her to the tractor, helping her climb onto the seat before handing her a bottle of water from his tool bag. She drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. "I'm Hollis," the man said as he climbed onto the tractor beside her. "I've got a small farm just down the road. Let me take you there. You can clean up and rest. We'll figure out what to do next." Ruth hesitated, glancing back toward the pit. "I don't want any trouble," she said softly. "Those boys and their families won't take kindly to me making this public." Hollis frowned, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "What they did to you is a crime," he said firmly. "They deserve to face the consequences." "I know," Ruth replied, her voice heavy with weariness, "but I've lived in this town long enough to know how things work. Justice isn't always fair." Hollis stared at her for a long moment, then nodded grimly. "All right," he said. "Let's get you home first. You can decide what to do after you've had some rest." The tractor rumbled to life, its engine breaking the silence once more. Hollis navigated it carefully through the cornfield and onto the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Ruth sat beside him, her hands clutching the bottle of water as her thoughts churned. Who were those boys? She recognized some of their faces, but not all. And why had one of them, Trevor, she thought his name was, looked so stricken? His hesitation had been clear, his guilt palpable. Perhaps there was still hope for him, she thought. Perhaps he wasn't lost to the hatred that consumed the others. As they reached Hollis's farm, a mod spread with a weathered barn and a cozy house nestled beneath a large oak tree, Ruth felt a flicker of relief. The warm glow of the porch light was a beacon in the cold night. Hollis helped her down from the tractor and led her inside, where he fetched a blanket and a cup of tea. "You can stay here tonight if you want," he offered, setting the tea on the table in front of her. "Or I can drive you home once you're ready." Ruth sipped the tea, letting its warmth seep into her. "Thank you, Hollis. I'll go home soon. I just need to sit for a moment." He nodded and sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You're sure you don't want to go to the police?" "I'll go with you if that's what you want." Ruth shook her head. "No, not yet. I need to think about the best way to handle this." Hollis leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're a better person than I am, Ruth. If it were me, I'd want to see them punished." Ruth met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "Punishment isn't always the answer. Sometimes people need to be shown a different path." Hollis didn't reply immediately, but his expression softened. He nodded again, a hint of respect in his eyes. "All right, but if you change your mind, you let me know those boys shouldn't get away with this." Ruth smiled faintly, though her heart was still heavy. "I'll think about it," she promised. As the night deepened, Ruth sat in the warmth of Hollis's kitchen, her mind racing. She had survived the cruelty of the night, but what came next would determine whether it had the power to destroy or transform. The morning sun had barely risen above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and orange. When Trevor found himself standing in front of Jake's house, the gravel driveway crunched beneath his sneakers as he paced nervously, his eyes darting to the front door. He had barely slept since the night before, his mind haunted by the image of Mrs. Walker's face as she was dragged into the darkness of the cornfield. He needed to speak with Jake to convince him that they had to fix what they'd done. With a deep breath, Trevor finally gathered enough courage to walk up to the door and knock. The sound echoed in the quiet morning air, each rap of his knuckles adding to his anxiety. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Jake still in his pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. His expression darkened the moment he saw Trevor. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded in a low and bad voice with annoyance. "It's early." Trevor swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot of fear in his stomach. "I need to talk to you. It's about last night." Jake's eyes narrowed, and he stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. He looked around as if checking to make sure no one else was watching or listening. "I thought I made it clear we don't talk about last night." Trevor's heart pounded in his chest, but he pressed on. "Jake, we went too far. Mrs. Walker could be seriously hurt or worse. We need to go back and make sure she's okay." Jake snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Are you kidding me? She's fine." Trevor stopped worrying about it. "She's not fine." Trevor's voice rose, surprising even himself. His eyes widened as he stared at Jake. "We buried her alive, Jake. What if no one found her? What if she's still out there?" Jake's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Trevor thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then Jake shook his head, his expression hardening. "She's just some old lady. She'll get over it." Trevor took a step closer, his hands trembling at his sides. "She's not just some old lady. She's Mrs. Walker. She's helped so many people in this town, including my family. What we did was wrong, you know it." Jake's eyes flashed with anger. He stepped closer, towering over Trevor. "You listen to me, Trevor. You keep your mouth shut about this. If you go to the cops or tell anyone, we're all going down. And believe me, I'll make sure you get the worst of it." Trevor's stomach twisted, but he held his ground. He could see the fear behind Jake's eyes, the desperation in his threats. Jake was scared, and Trevor knew why, because deep down he knew they had crossed a line. Before Trevor could respond, the door opened again, and Jake's father stepped out onto the porch. He was a large man, his presence instantly commanding. His eyes moved from Jake to Trevor, his brow furrowed. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice gruff. He looked at Trevor, his gaze piercing. "Why are you here this early?" Trevor opened his mouth to speak, but Jake cut him off. "Nothing, Dad. Just talking about some school stuff." Trevor was just leaving. Jake's father eyed them both for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, keep it down. It's too early for all this racket." Jake nodded quickly, and his father went back inside, leaving the two boys alone again. Jake turned back to Trevor, his expression dark. "Get out of here, Trevor, and don't come back." Trevor hesitated, then turned and walked back down the driveway. His heart heavy, he had hoped that maybe he could get through to Jake. But it was clear now that Jake wouldn't budge. He was too afraid of losing control or facing the consequences of his actions. As Trevor walked away, his mind raced. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. But he also knew that going to the police alone would be risky. Jake had already made it clear what he would do if anyone talked. Trevor needed another way, a way to help Mrs. Walker without putting himself or the others in even greater danger. Later that day, Trevor found himself at Chris's house. He had called Chris earlier asking to meet, and now they sat in the dimly lit garage, the scent of motor oil and dust heavy in the air. Chris leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed as he listened to Trevor. "I went to see Jake this morning," Trevor said, his voice quiet. "I tried to convince him that we need to make things right, but he won't listen." Chris sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "What did you expect, Trev? Jake's not going to back down. He's too proud, too scared. We all know he took it too far, but now he's in too deep." Trevor nodded, his expression grim. "I know, but we can't just leave it like this. What if Mrs. Walker was hurt or worse?" Chris shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know, man. I mean, I didn't want to do it in the first place, but Jake got everyone wrapped around his finger. It's not that easy to just go against him." Trevor took a deep breath. Gathering his courage, "I think we should go back. Just you and me. We can check on Mrs. Walker, make sure she's okay. Maybe we can talk to her, try to make things right." Chris looked up, his eyes widening. "Are you serious? Want to go back there? What if Jake finds out he won't?" Trevor insisted. "We'll go when no one's around. We just need to make sure she's okay." I can't live with myself if we don't at least do that." Chris was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching Trevor's face. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right. I'll go with you, but if Jake finds out, we're both screwed." Trevor managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Chris. I promise we'll be careful that evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town." Trevor and Chris made their way back to the cornfield. The air was cold, and a heavy silence hung between them as they walked. Their flashlights cut in narrow beams through the growing darkness. They reached the spot where they had left Mrs. Walker the night before. Their footsteps slowed as they approached the pit. The soil was still disturbed, but the pit was empty. Trevor's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of relief and fear washing over him. "Sheck, gone," Chris said, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybeen found her." Trevor nodded, his throat tightened. "And I hope so." He looked around. His flashlight beam swept across the field. There was no sign of her, no sign that anything had happened here at all except for the turned-up dirt and the lingering sense of dread in his chest. "Come on," Chris said, nudging Trevor's arm. "We should get out of here before someone sees us." Trevor hesitated, then turned and followed Chris out of the field as they walked. His mind raced. Mrs. Walker was gone, which meant she had either managed to escape or someone had found her. He prayed that she was all right, that she had made it home safely, but he prayed that she was all right, that she had made it home safely. But he couldn't just walk away from what they had done, and even if Jake refused to admit it, Trevor knew that deep down he was just as scared as the rest of them. Trevor made a silent promise to himself as they left the field behind. He would find a way to make things right, no matter what it took. The next morning was crisp, with the cool autumn air bringing a sense of renewal. Ruth sat at her small kitchen table, her hands cradling a steaming cup of tea as she stared out the window. Her body still ached from the night's ordeal, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had thought long and hard about what had happened, and she knew what she had to do next. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wanted understanding change. She wanted those boys to see the impact of their actions and to find a better way forward. She knew where one of those boys lived. The Thompson family was well known in town, and it was no secret that Jake had a younger friend named Trevor. She had seen Trevor with Jake's group before, and last night, she had seen the fear and hesitation in his eyes. He hadn't wanted to hurt her. Maybe there was still hope for him. After dressing in a modest blouse and cardigan, Ruth left her house and began her walk across town to the Wilkins residence, Trevor's home. The streets were quiet at this hour, the town just beginning to stir. Ruth felt the eyes of a few of her neighbors as she walked by, but she kept her head high, her steps deliberate and measured. When she reached Trevor's house, she paused at the edge of the driveway. It was a modest two-story home with a small front porch and a garden that needed tending. She could see a curtain move in one of the front windows, and she took a deep breath before stepping up to the door, and knocking. The sound of footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s. Her face was lined with fatigue, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked at Ruth with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ruth smiled gently. "Good morning, my name is Ruth Walker. I'm here to speak with your son, Trevor." The woman's brow furrowed. "Trevor, what's this about?" Ruth hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's about something that happened last night. It's important." The woman who Ruth assumed must be Trevor's mother looked at her more closely, her eyes widening slightly as if recognizing something unspoken. She stepped aside and gestured for Ruth to enter. "Come in. Trevor's in the living room." Ruth stepped inside. The air in the house was warm compared to the chilly morning outside. Trevor's mother led her through the narrow hallway to the living room, where Trevor was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it. When he saw Ruth, his face went pale and his eyes widened in shock. "Mrs. Walker," he whispered, his voice trembling. Ruth nodded, giving him a small smile. "Hello, Trevor." Trevor's mother looked between them, her expression now one of concern. "Trevor, what is this about?" Trevor swallowed hard, unable to meet his mother's gaze. Ruth stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Trevor's face. "I came here to talk to Trevor about last night, and I think your mother deserves to hear the truth." TR's mother frowned, her gaze snapping to her son Trevor. "What is she talking about?" Trevor's shoulders slumped, and he let out a shaky breath. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." His mother's eyes narrowed, and she moved to sit next to him on the couch. "Tell me." Trevor looked at Ruth, and she nodded in encouragement. He took a deep breath, then turned back to his mother, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last night, I and some other guys did something really bad to Mrs. Walker." His mother's face went white, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What do you mean?" "Trevor, what did you do?" Trevor hesitated, and Ruth stepped in. "They dragged me out to an old cornfield," she said softly, her eyes on Trevor's mother. "They buried me up to my neck and left me there." The room fell silent, the weight of Ruth's words settling like a heavy stone. Trevor's mother stared at her son, her mouth opening and closing as if struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Trevor, is this true?" Tears welled in Trevor's eyes, and he nodded his head, bowed in shame. "I didn't want to, Mom. I swear I didn't want to hurt her, but Jake made us do it, and I didn't stop him." His mother's face twisted in pain and disbelief. She turned to Ruth, her voice cracking. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Ruth reached out, placing her hand gently on the woman's arm. "I'm not here to blame you or even to demand punishment for Trevor. I came here because I want Trevor to understand what he did, to understand that there are consequences, but also that there is a chance to do better." Trevor looked up, his tear-filled eyes meeting Ruth's. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how, but I want to." Ruth smiled gently. "That's why I'm here. I want you and the others to come to the church. I want you to help fix what was broken and fix the damage you caused. I'm not asking for anything more than that." Trevor's mother looked at Ruth, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "You've given him a chance to make amends." Ruth nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, and I think Trevor wants to change." Trevor wiped his eyes, nodding vigorously. "I do, I really do." Ruth turned back to Trevor's mother. "I need Trevor to gather the others, those who were there. I want all of them to come to the church this weekend. We have work to do, and I believe they can help." Trevor's mother placed her hand over Ruth's, her voice trembling. "Thank you for giving him a chance, for giving all of them a chance." Ruth smiled. "I believe in second chances, and I believe that what we do next matters more than what we did before." The sun was bright and warm that Saturday morning as Ruth stood in front of the church, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the boys she had spent the past few days preparing herself, knowing that this meeting could go either way. She hoped that her message had been received, that the boys would be willing to face what they had done and take a step toward change. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Trevor. Chris and two of the other boys were walking up the path. They looked nervous, their eyes downcast, but they had come. Trevor gave her a small, tentative smile, and she returned it, her heart swelling with cautious hope behind them. Jake appeared, his expression dark, his shoulders squared as if he were walking into a battle. Ruth watched him carefully, noting the tension in his jaw and the defiance in his eyes. She could tell he was there because he had no choice, because his friends had come, and he couldn't let them face it without him. Ruth took a deep breath and stepped forward to meet them. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We have work to do." Jake scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You really think this is going to change anything?" Ruth met his gaze, her expression steady. "I think it's a start," she said simply. "And what happens next is up to you." Jake hesitated, his eyes flickering to his friends. They looked at him, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. He sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Fine. Let's just get this over with." Ruth smiled. "Let's get started." And then she led them to the back of the church, where a wooden bench had been broken during their scuffle the night they had dragged her away. It was heavy work, lifting and mending the splintered wood using tools to piece it back together, but the boys worked in silence, their focus on the task at hand as they worked. Ruth spoke to them, telling them about the church, about the community it served, and about the people who relied on it. She shared stories of kindness, of resilience, and of the power of forgiveness. She spoke not to shame them, but to inspire them, to show them what they could be if they chose a different path. Ruth's eyes softened, and she nodded. Yes, I do. I believe everyone can change. Jake, it's not about what you've done before. It's about what you choose to do now and every day after. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had spent so many nights replaying the events of that terrible evening, seeing Ruth's terrified face, the fear he had instilled in her. He had acted out of anger, out of a twisted need to prove himself, and yet here she was, offering him a way out, a way to be better. He looked at her, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. I want to be better. I don't want to be like this anymore." Ruth smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "And you can be. You've already taken the first step. Jake, the rest is just a matter of staying the course." The other boys watched from a short distance away, their eyes widening as they saw Jake open up to Ruth. Trevor exchanged a glance with Chris, a smile of relief passing between them. They could all see the change in Jake, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. After lunch, Ruth gathered the boys together. She looked at each of them, her eyes filled with pride. "Today we're not just going to work on the church," she said. "I want us to take this kindness out into the community. There are people in this town who could use our help, people who need to see that we can be better, that we can choose kindness." Trevor's heart swelled with determination. He nodded eagerly, glancing at his friends. They all exchanged looks, a silent agreement passing between them. They were ready to do more to show that they were truly changing. Ruth led them down the street, and they stopped at Mrs. Johnson's house, a small, cozy home with a sagging porch. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly black woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, had struggled to maintain her property as she grew older. Ruth knocked on her door, and when Mrs. Johnson answered, her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of the group. "Morning, Mrs. Johnson," Ruth said warmly. "We're here to help you with your porch. It needs a bit of fixing up, don't you think?" Mrs. Johnson blinked, her gaze moving from Ruth to the group of boys standing behind her. Her eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing some of their faces. "You boys are here to help?" she asked, her voice wary. Trevor stepped forward, his voice earnest. "Yes, ma'am. We want to help fix your porch if you'll let us." Mrs. Johnson studied them for a long moment, her gaze lingering on Jake, who shifted uncomfortably. Finally, she nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "All right then, let's see what you can do." The boys worked hard throughout the afternoon under Ruth's guidance and Mrs. Johnson's watchful eye. They replaced the broken boards, sanded the wood, and applied a fresh coat of paint. As they worked, Ruth spoke to Mrs. Johnson, her voice calm and soothing, sharing stories of the boys' efforts to change slowly. Mrs. Johnson's weariness began to fade. She watched as Jake carefully nailed a board into place, his expression focused and sincere. She saw the way Trevor and Chris worked together, their laughter genuine as they passed the paintbrush between them. And she saw the way Ruth looked at them all, her eyes filled with pride. By the time the porch was finished, the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the street. Mrs. Johnson stepped out onto her new porch, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It looks wonderful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, boys. I didn't think I'd see the day when someone would come help an old woman like me." Jake looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. He felt something shift inside him, something that felt like genuine hope. He stepped forward, his voice quiet. "We're just glad we could help, ma'am." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her smile widening. "Well, you boys did good today. You should be proud." The boys all exchanged smiles, a sense of accomplishment washing over them. Ruth watched them, her heart full, as she saw the change in their eyes. They had faced their past, taken responsibility for their actions, and now they were choosing to make a difference as the boys gathered their tools and prepared to leave. Mrs. Johnson called out to Ruth, "You did a good thing with these boys, Mrs. "Walker," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "you showed them that they could be better." Ruth smiled, her eyes twinkling. "They showed themselves that Mrs. Johnson and I just gave them the opportunity." And with that, the boys and Ruth made their way back to the church. The evening air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. The weight of what had happened that terrible night had not disappeared, but it had lightened. It had transformed into something new, something that had the power to heal. They all knew they had a long way to go, but they were ready to walk that path together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share this video with friends and check out our other stories. There's always more to explore.